Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Irvine, and I am just going to have a quick chat before we start the session with forester Dr. Rodrigo Lave, who is in charge of the AFBI research program. Rodrigo, we're seeing a clip here of your poplar plot at Loughgall. How long are these planted, I wonder?
Hi, good evening to everybody. My name is Rodrigo Lave, as Brian was introducing myself. So then those poplars were planted in 1999. They are today 20 years. There are 4 different varieties. Some of them bred because more resistant to different diseases such as melanspora and canker. Those poplar trees were planted following a silvo-arable type of system, which is alleys of trees and planted between trees about 12 meters by 5 meters. In the beginning, those trees, in between trees, we had a barley crop, which was working very well for a number of years.
Okay, and after the barley, Rodrigo, I suppose that was in for 7 or 8 years, and maybe then we moved on to grass silage system. Is that right?
Yeah, before that, after we tested the barley, then we decided to use that piece of land to grow an energy crop. As you can see now, we are looking at the ash trees agroforestry silvopastoral system. Those ash trees were planted in 31 years ago. It's different than the silvo-arable because those were planted at 5 meters by 5 meters. So then sheep would be allowed grazing around those areas. And those trees today are 31 years old, and they've been thinned twice when they were 13 years old. So the canopy was very close at that time. So in order to allow better grass production, then some of the trees were removed. And then after 7 years, and again, some of the trees were thinned out. And as you can see now, after 31 years, we have about 250, 230 trees per hectare. So as you can see, there is a very good grass production, and where sheep can graze in very different situations. So then, and also you have some of the outputs from the system, such as timber and sheep production and grass production.
And I suppose we normally have some sheep grazing on that system. Unfortunately, the day we filmed, there was none there, but it's quite an atmosphere when you walk into those trees from the grazing paddock beside. I'm always quite impressed. The wind is cut down. It's a nice atmosphere in there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting experimental site because, as you can see, there are the agroforestry or silvopastoral system, where it was compared against a grassland system and also against a conventional woodland system, which are all distributed in that area, in that experimental area in AFBI Loughgall.
And I wonder, when did we take out the thinnings, Rodrigo? You mentioned we're down to 230 trees per hectare now, started at 400. You know, what year, or what after many years did we take the thinnings?
Well, as I mentioned before, at the year 13 in this agroforestry experimental area, about 30% of the trees were removed. In conventional forestry, there are a number of thinning because of the number of trees that are planted in the beginning, which is a lot more, over 3,000 trees per hectare in conventional forestry. But in agroforestry, what we are aiming is that the majority of trees that you are planted in year zero are or will become the final crop. So then that's why some of the trees, and we're trying to focus on quality timber, and also to manage the site in a way that is balanced in terms of grass production and on sheep grazing.
We have a bit of branching, I guess, in the trees that we're looking at, some different than others. Did we use different cultivars in here? I wonder, did we do a lot of pruning management at the beginning?
In that particular case, with ash, we didn't. We didn't use any special type of plant. Those were from a nursery in Scotland. Very good quality plants, and those trees were pruned twice. Around the year 10 and then the year 12 or 13. And as you can see now, for example, which is quite a different experience, working with different tree species, you are looking at cherry trees, which were planted 6 years ago as part of our research looking at different varieties of cherries. We were interested in cherry trees for agroforestry, in this case silvoarable system, because its timber is very valuable. The market for this timber is very high compared to ash and poplar and other species. So then we wanted to follow similar silvoarable system as you saw earlier on, or using poplar. In this case, some of those cherry trees were produced in nurseries in England, and also we are looking at the performance of different clones, different varieties of cherries, compared to natural wild cherries growing in Ireland. And as you can see, some of those trees, although they are very young, but they are performing very well. And in between the trees, we will have another crop, another agricultural crop. And back now to the poplar tree silvoarable system. As I was saying earlier, in the beginning, we had a barley crop, which did work very well until the canopy of poplar trees started to compete. And then we decided to change crop. That's why, as you can see, a very flexible system in which you can, for some years when competition between trees and crops is not very intense, then the system is flexible, so then we can change crop depending on the characteristics of the system. Then now this silvoarable system went back to grass, and now we are using that one for sheep grazing. You can see it's very well protected site. When you even walk through, the difference between in humidity is very considerable. So in wet days, sheep prefer to be and graze around those trees rather than outside. As I was saying earlier, we were studying these different varieties of poplar. Those poplars are 20 years old, and some varieties are performing much better than others, and even some of these varieties are ready to be harvested. Say, for example, in the past, there was a very active market for poplar trees, and now is less active than in the past, but it's still poplar trees with good diameters, straight, can get a very attractive price for example, pallets, veneers, and that type of products. Some of the other no very good quality timber, it can go to the biomass market, which is also an interesting market for those growing biomass.
We'll start our webinar. Let me introduce everyone first of all. So this is our first in a series of 2 webinars on agroforestry. My name is Brian Irvine, and I'm a biodiversity technologist at CAFRE, and the biodiversity team has a role in environmental farming scheme promotion and delivering and developing training events and demonstrating technologies on CAFRE and other farms. So this is going to be a sort of a technical look at the research developments over the past 30 years from Loughgall. And then next week on Tuesday the 8th of September, we have our second agroforestry webinar, and we're focusing on the early years establishment, planting equipment, the scheme details, and where you get your trees and time of year to plant, etc. I'd like to welcome our 2 panel speakers who both have considerable research experience with agroforestry, Dr. Rodrigo Lave from AFBI and Dr. Jim McAdam, Emeritus Professor with Queen's University Belfast. Rodrigo is an enthusiastic forester and researcher who is now running the agroforestry program at AFBI, and Jim has been involved with agroforestry research over the past 3 decades, having instigated the AFBI research program back in the 1980s. In addition to this, we have Nicola Warden, who has organised this event and acts as host, and will call from CAFRE to provide technical support. So we're going to focus on agroforestry and its relevance to Northern Ireland tonight. Agroforestry is an option within the EFS scheme and has been undertaken by approximately 50 farmers, with another 27 due to establish their options in 2020. It is a technology that is both simple and yet complex in its outputs. It addresses our desire to both maintain farming and also make an impact on soil and climate resilience, biodiversity, and develop an additional crop. Most participants are dipping their toe in the waters with modest areas in 1 or 2 fields, and I think this is a sensible starting approach. To quote my colleague Terence Henry, keep it simple and do it well. In the second webinar, we will cover the specifications for agroforestry and the AFS scheme in detail and farmers' experiences of the first 2 years. So there are important messages for those of you embarking on it this year. But first, we are very fortunate to have two distinguished researchers to hear about the relevance of agroforestry to Northern Ireland and the long-term research and experiences of the 30-year AFBI programme. So I'm now going to hand over to the two panel speakers. So Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks for the introduction. What I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is to talk about agroforestry system and some of the history of our research in AFBI for the last 30 years, and also talk about some of the benefits, economic benefits, as well as environmental benefits of the system. As Brian was saying, my name is Rodrigo Lave. I work for AFBI. I am responsible for the agroforestry research platform at AFBI Loughgall. Next one, Nicola, please. So as an introduction, I would like to say a few things about agriculture in Northern Ireland, which was something that 30 years ago had an impact in terms of us looking into different alternatives for sustainable land use. So agricultural intensification has resulted in, for example, loss of biodiversity, soil degradation, increased greenhouse gas emissions, low carbon potential, reduced water quality, and a degraded rural landscape, as you can see on that photograph. All those factors then needed an environmental sustainable land use system to look at. So then, next one, Nicola, please. So then that's why agroforestry at the time was a very novel and interesting approach for land management with multiple benefits. Some of the experiences that colleagues were looking at was in the US and in New Zealand. But when people say agroforestry, what does it mean? So agroforestry, first of all, is a farming system that, as you can see on the photograph, which combines trees with agricultural crops or livestock. In that case, as you saw earlier in the video clip, then it's a typical silvopastoral system that was established 30 years ago. And you see the three activities combined. You have timber production, sheep production, and grassland production. Next one, please. A little bit of history about the agroforestry research program at AFBI. As I mentioned, it started in 1989. There were three important elements at the time. The first one was that the main driver at that time in the whole of the UK was that the country and the countries had very low tree cover, and also as part of that driver, then AFBI joined a network of agroforestry experimental work throughout the UK. As part of that network, a number of experimental trials were established in different parts of the UK, and one site that was selected was AFBI Loughgall, where trials comparing grassland, agroforestry, and woodland system were compared. As you can see on those photographs, there is what the place looks like today. We have silvoarable system, silvopastoral system with different type of livestock, as well as a recent experience using apple orchards with sheep grazing. Next one, please. After all many years conducting research on agroforestry at Loughgall and AFBI, there have been a number of findings from this research. Some of them, for example, are that establishing trees at wide spacing works for timber production, for environmental benefits, and for grass production and sheep production. And also, the system is capable of delivering many other outputs, such as, for example, meat, wool, timber, and there are other niche markets that also can be, or we have seen in the past, such as, for example, timber for the harvesting market in Ireland, which is very attractive. And also we have seen experiences from other farmers in different parts of the UK, mixing trees and poultry, which is another type of agroforestry system. Next one, please. And also, the system offers a lot of environmental benefits. Over the last 30 years, we've been looking at 10 different environmental benefits from agroforestry system, such as nutrient cycling, drainage, erosion, animal welfare, pollution, shelter from wind and rain, shade from sun. But today, in the next 10 minutes or so within this presentation, I'm going to focus in on three very important environmental benefits, which also are a part of the environmental farming scheme. Those are carbon sequestration, agroforestry system offsetting greenhouse gas emissions, and the benefit of enhancing biodiversity. Next one. The carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emission is a very important area of work, and it's an important activity for many farmers and industry in the country. As you can see on the slide, that's a typical calculation for greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration, where it takes all the activities involved in producing, for example, milk or meat. Producing all those products from agriculture implies emissions. Some of those emissions come from methane, from fermentation, fertilizers, manure emissions, and many others. So, but one way of offsetting some of the emissions producing these products is storing carbon. So carbon can be stored in the soil, in grassland soils, for example, and also by planting trees. An alternative then, as you can see on that slide, is by establishing agroforestry systems. So then you will sequester carbon. Therefore, you will be offsetting the emissions to produce in milk, meat, or any other product from agriculture. Next one, please. Another important today environmental problem that we have in the country is ammonia emissions that is coming from livestock production and other agricultural activities. So then We've been looking at agroforestry as a mean to reduce ammonia emissions, and we have seen that trees recapture about looking at other research colleagues 27% of ammonia onto the vegetation. And I think depending where these agroforestry systems are planted, depending how close the source of ammonia is, so then there is a different type of system that can be established in farms. Next one, please. As I mentioned before, another environmental benefit from a silvopastoral, silvoarable system is biodiversity. Biodiversity from agricultural system lack in biodiversity and compared to natural ecosystem. In the case of agroforestry system, the silvoarable and the silvopastoral system that we've been investigating at AFBI Loughgall have shown that are complex compared to either system, agricultural system and natural ecosystem, and the agroforestry system having more being more diverse in comparison to the other ones. And also, this agroforestry system provide a range of food, shelter, habitat, and other resources because of we have more biodiversity in them. Next one, please. And finally, only another slide, but just to conclude, what we can say from the last 30 years of research on agroforestry at AFBI is that trees enhance biodiversity on farms. Also, this agroforestry system have the capacity to offset greenhouse gas emissions, provide habitat for wildlife, and increase productivity as well as intercepting pollutant if they are established near sources of ammonia, for example. Another conclusion from our research, our work in AFBI, is that with good management, animals can be kept outside for longer, which means that will be offsetting ammonia emissions. Trees can provide shield for crops and reduce considerable wind and changes in temperatures around these areas. And finally, as I said before, agroforestry is a farming system, combines trees, livestock, or agricultural crops. So then by having two crops, say for example, livestock or timber trees, it can increase total yield and on-farm productivity. Next one, please. And with this one, I'm finishing the talk. And what I want to say is to show you or give you a small summary of the current agroforestry research that we are conducting today at AFBI and for the next maybe 4 or 5 years. We are taking part in a number of research projects developed by a consortium of more than 25 partners in Europe. So some of those projects have been started already. For example, the first one is Under Trees, which is an agroforestry project funded by the European Commission, consistent in investigate even further agroforestry system and all the ecosystem services from this system. A second one, which is a larger project, is AgroMix, which is a project, an agroforestry. It's not an agroforestry project, but it's an agroecological solution for farm and land management, which incorporates agroforestry system as an agroecological solution for land management. And finally, Fed Forest is a project funded by the Department of Agriculture here in Northern Ireland, as well as the Department of Agriculture in the south, in which we are looking at a range of tree species in the whole of Ireland and how these respond to climate change. So then we will be assessing these species and identify those more suitable for different land uses. Thank you very much. You have my contact there and my email as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And we'll now pass over to Jim for the second part of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim McAdam. As Brian introduced me, I used to work for AFBI. I'm retired now, but I've been involved with the agroforestry program really since the early years. And just as a follow-on from Rodrigo's, I just want to give you now some sort of depth to some of the work that we did at Loughgall and to outline really the potential benefits of agroforestry that we've found. So if we look at the wider picture, if you move on, Rodrigo, perhaps if we think of this idea of ecosystem services, and really that's those are big words that we've banded around recently, but really simply what they mean are just all the benefits that we get by ecosystems that contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. In other words, in simple terms, what does nature or the countryside do for us? If you look at that photograph, which just could be taken anywhere in Northern Ireland, it's taken County Antrim, but that's a very typical scene, and we just sometimes take it for granted. Oh, that's just a nice piece of farmland and a bit of a lake in the middle. But really, if we think of it in more depth, that's giving us an awful lot more than simply some wool, some meat, maybe milk, some timber. It's giving us, first of all, lovely scenery, which helps enhance the quality of our lives, which maybe brings tourists along. It also is giving us pure, clean water to drink, because many of those areas are upland catchment areas. It's giving us flood control, and very importantly, it's giving us soil, and it's giving us a quality of carbon storage in that soil, which, as we know, is vitally important when we're trying to really make our agricultural systems more carbon neutral. How can we offset some of those emissions that we have? So every scene that we look at is really giving this whole range of benefits. So if we look now at an agroforestry scene, such as Rodrigo's been talking about, and we move on to that, we can give an idea of what ecosystem services can agroforestry deliver for us. How can agroforestry help solve some of the key challenges that farming is facing today? Things like climate change mitigation, carbon balance of farms, loss of biodiversity, and really trying to come up with sustainable farming systems that move into the future and how we can best address some of those key issues. So there's, if you think, let's think of our agroforestry scene now in the wider context of the ecosystem services it can deliver. First of all, it's quite attractive if you've got trees spaced out at wide spacings in a farmed landscape. It does lead to a more balanced visual appearance to the countryside. It's delivering us energy, as well as obviously the crops and the meat and the wool that we can have below those trees. And Rodrigo talked about growing crops underneath as well. But it's delivering a wide range of environmental benefits. Those trees could be pollinators as well. There's obviously more biodiversity. Planting trees is a good thing. You can have a range of types of trees, all of which can lead to enhance the biodiversity we have. We know from our research, which I'll talk more about in the rest of my talk, how agroforestry leads us to reducing floods by letting more water seep into the soil. And we know, of course, that it's storing carbon in the soil. We know that trees, that wood are good as a carbon store. But agroforestry is also helping us make our soil more healthy and store carbon better. And why is that? Simply, it's because of the complexity of the interactions that the agroforestry system is. If you take a simple sheep grazing or cattle grazing on grass, that's a fairly simple system. The animals are grazing, they produce dung and urine, nutrients are recycled, the farmer puts on some fertilizer or slurry perhaps, and the whole thing ticks over. But it's a reasonably simple system, and if there's too much fertilizer goes on or too much slurry, the nutrients end up getting below the grass roots and they get in the water. It's an ordinary grassland system has relatively low levels of biodiversity depending on the crops that are there. But if we put a tree into that system, you can see that immediately we get a much more complex ecosystem. And as we know, the more complex things are in nature, the more stable they are, the more they deliver for us, and the better they are for people in society. So that's why really our agroforest systems are biologically very healthy. Okay, now if we move on just to think about the trials we've done at Loughgall, and Rodrigo gave you some background to those. One of the key things that has come out of that work really is, first of all, that we can actually on a farm integrate agroforestry into farming systems. When we set out 30 years ago on this road to test agroforestry, I think it's fair to say that almost all of us researchers were agriculturalists, agronomists, or people interested in pasture. We didn't actually manage to bring the foresters on board then as we have now. And that was really to our disadvantage, because we could have concentrated a bit more on trees, but we were really interested in showing that this could be a grassland system that could be much more sustainable by adding trees to it. And you can see in the top row picture there, just spreading fertilizer at Loughgall. We could have shown you pictures of topping, putting on slurry, any of the normal grassland management features that you do. And one of the beauties that we found about agroforestry is the diversity of system that you can have. There's a nice poultry system in the bottom left. There's sheep under trees. There's some nice belted Galloway cows, all of these in Ireland, on this island. There are all these benefits that animals and the system is delivering. Top right picture there, you can see that anytime the leaves fall, or if we do some pruning in the ash plots we had, the sheep mopped up the leaves immediately and they got the benefits of fodder. And we know from research that we've done in other countries that tree leaf fodder can be very nutritionally advantaged. It can be high protein, and it can help deliver better quality of animal production. So economically, we've shown the systems are sustainable. When we come to environmentally, as Rodrigo outlined, some of the key problems that we have in Northern Ireland. And a lot of those really revolve around nutrients and nutrient cycling. We know that the high phosphate in our soils is a key problem. The red areas in the middle of that top picture there, really in mid-Ulster and in areas and other areas as well, show that we have a real problem with high levels of phosphate in the soil. Scientists and others are looking at ways they can, mechanical ways or engineering solutions for that. But we also want to be looking for biological solutions to that. And we know that if we plant trees in those type of scenarios, trees have the ability to absorb high levels of phosphate in their roots. And that phosphate is well below the level of grassroot systems. So that could help us extract phosphate from the soil into the timber from the trees, which could then be removed. So this idea of nutrient leakage, as we know, the grass roots down to maybe 20, 30 centimeters at the most. But if we have a wide-spaced tree system in that pasture, there's a layer of tree roots well below that, going down well below 1 meter. And those trees have the capacity to absorb nutrients, anything that escapes below the grass. And they don't tend to compete with the grass because they are below that level. They are environmentally sustainable because one of our key issues now is carbon and carbon sequestration. We are concerned about how much carbon can we get into our farming systems. Biodiversity then, Rodrigo mentioned, and some of the research on biodiversity we've done at Loughgall. These graphs just show the levels of insects, birds, beetles, and I haven't put on worms, earthworms there, but The middle bar in all those graphs is agroforestry. The left one is grassland. The right one is woodland. So comparing those systems in an experimental trial, we found much higher level of biodiversity in the agroforestry. Okay, now as I've mentioned and Rodrigo's mentioned, carbon is really on everybody's lips. We're really trying to get farming systems that are much more carbon friendly. So our agroforestry, right from the start, when we started this program in the late 1980s, carbon was not high on everyone's agenda. We were doing it for different reasons. But of course, as time went on, we knew that we were actually creating a system which had the potential to be very carbon friendly, to store a lot of carbon. Fortunately, Rodrigo was able to get some funding about 8 or 9 years ago. We were able to completely harvest some of the trees in Loughgall, dig them out, roots and all, and measure the carbon in the entire amount of tree. And we found that in those trees, which were by then 21 years old, there was about 77 tons of carbon per hectare in the woody biomass alone. So if we divide that by 3, for example, if we divide that 77 by 21, we get over 3 tons of carbon per hectare has now accumulated in that agroforest, and that's just in the wood alone. The grassland part of the system is obviously growing. We have an active grass sward below the trees, and that itself is storing carbon in the soil. So if we then decided to look, if we could just go back to the previous slide there, Rodrigo. We then looked at the amount of carbon that there was actually stored in the soil, and we found that the carbon in agroforestry was actually quite unique in that the carbon was all bound to very small soil particles. This meant that it was much less likely to be lost or given off as carbon dioxide from the soil. So the carbon store, if we summarize on the carbon story, Rodrigo, in terms of soil carbon, there's more soil carbon stored in the ash silvopasture than the other systems. And when carbon is stored in the wood, is added in, as I said, from the trees, these agroforestry systems have the potential to store long-term and both long-term and short-term carbon. If we think of a typical ryegrass pasture, we could be getting something, let's say averaging a ton of carbon stored per hectare per year. We've shown from our silvopasture, of course, in the early years, you're not getting as much, so you have to balance it out over years. Let's say we could be actively getting about 2.5 tons of carbon stored from the trees in the silvopasture. So adding those together, we're starting to get up to levels which are almost equivalent to a normal forest plantation, yet we're still having the benefits of the agricultural component of the system. Okay, Rodrigo. So the carbon story was a good one. And we move on there, Rodrigo, to think a bit about the effect of the trees on the soil percolation, on the ability of the water to seep down below the trees. Because obviously with climate change, one of the things we're getting are flash floods and high bursts of rainfall. The soil isn't able to cope with the rain, which then runs off, and we end up with flooding and soil not able to get away. Because we had the agroforestry systems, which have been growing almost 30 years, we were able to look at the movement of water down through the trees. And when we looked at how the water was in the agroforestry, water was able to percolate down through the soil system much better than in grassland. What that actually meant was, if you look at your soil moisture profile over the winter, and in those graphs, the top graph is the soil moisture content in the grassland plots alone, because don't forget, in our trials we had replicate plots of grassland and agroforestry. And the bottom graph is the soil moisture content through the agroforestry over a winter period. If we assume that, say, about 40% soil moisture, anything above that, you're going to run risks of poaching. So you really want to be taking animals off the ground if your soil moisture content gets above 40%. And we found that animals were able to spend approximately 12 to 15 weeks longer outside on the grass in the agroforestry than in the grassland only plots. This does two benefits. Number one, improves the utilization of grassland. Number two, it means that while animals are less time outside, they're producing less ammonia. Therefore, you're helping to deal with your ammonia problem by having them grazing out in the agroforestry. And it's also healthier and has other benefits. As I said, we were able to look right down to the profile and the outer level, the outer red dots there, that's going right down with sticking a probe down which looks at infiltration potential. And you can see right down till about 76 centimeters below the ground in the soil, agroforestry had significantly better infiltration of soil. So in our sort of climate challenged conditions we're coming into, there's potentially a good benefit to agroforestry. Okay, Rodrigo. So those proven benefits from agriculture, from silvopasture over agriculture. Just to summarise, agroforestry gives you an extended grazing season, more grass utilisation, and more resilience to grazing during extreme rainfall and reduced ammonia. Gives us increased biodiversity, and all this is experimentally demonstrated on our trial site at Loughgall and on other sites across the British Isles to back them up. We definitely are getting better carbon sequestration, reduced water runoff, and renewable fuel, as well as the potential to remove phosphate from a greater volume of soil. So really, what we're talking about is having a livestock-based system which is helping to address some of the real challenges that farming is facing. How can we make our ruminant agriculture, which is grass-based, how can we make that much more carbon neutral? We know all these emissions we get off from animals, from crops, or from various processes in the soil as well. But we have the opportunity to offset those by sequestering carbon in the ground to balance them out. And if we use trees in a more novel way on farms, either in hedges, make much more use of our hedgerows, but also by planting trees at wider spacing in pasture in an agroforestry system, we can start to bring a carbon balance. We know roughly the average for example, for a beef system, a livestock-based beef system, is about 4 tons of carbon per hectare per year emitted. Well, if you recall back to my figures for agroforestry, we were getting up to near that from our agroforestry pastures alone of carbon able to be sequestered instead of emitted. So if we could think of integrating some areas of agroforestry into our livestock system, we could be getting much more to a neutral system. So trees can be incorporated into livestock farms in a range of scenarios. Hedges contain a lot of stored carbon, and we've done quite a bit of work on that in AFBI. A PhD student, Jonathan Blair, has just done some work looking at the amount of carbon we store in hedges, and he's found that soil conditions and carbon can be directly influenced by hedges, and we've seen from our research in agroforestry that we can store carbon in agroforestry as well. Finally, really, how can we promote silvopasture in farms? Well, I see it as having a two-pronged attack. Agroforestry can be a tree production system. Trees can have a lot of value, high value for timber, for floristry, for all sorts of reasons. And we now know a lot more about tree genetics and how you can pick the right trees for your agroforestry to give you much added value to the system. So trees in our agroforestry system can be of great value. But we also see them as a grassland system, which can produce good food from meat, where farms can be made more sustainable and carbon friendly by incorporating trees at a range of levels in the diversity that agroforestry can offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim and Rodrigo. Excellent presentations, as always. At this stage, we're going to take some questions, and I'll just remind folks that to send in questions, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop. You hover your mouse at the bottom right, and for mobile users, there is a 3-dot icon when you tap your screen. If you're sending a question in, please select all panelists options. So there's quite a few questions in here. So we will have a look here at these. Rodrigo, a difficult one, but one that we should ask. What could a farm expect in terms of timber income?
Yes, Brian. Thanks for the question. Well, depends on what type of tree species the farmer is going to plant. There are a variety of tree species that we are testing at AFBI. Some fast-growing tree species, such as, for example, cherry and ash trees. Ash tree cannot be is not recommended now as a species to be planted, but cherry, for example, has the potential to be very attractive in terms of marketing its timber. There are other species, slow-growing tree species, such as oak, for example, that is going to take a long time to get a timber crop from. But I think, it's, as Jim earlier pointed out, it's not only about the commercial benefits from timber, but also these other environmental benefits, which would make a difference economically for farmers.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. I suppose leading on from that, really, we're chatting about different species there, and this leads on to the next question of where we should plant agroforestry. Should we plant it in good land, improved land, or marginal land? And I think I know what your answer is going to be here, Rodrigo, but you want to answer that one? So should I plant agroforestry? Yep.
In terms of agroforestry, yes. So we have seen, for example, in the country that our main commercial plantation in Northern Ireland is Sitka spruce, which has been planted in marginal land. But I think because we must compromise the very important agricultural activity in the country. And agroforestry is a flexible system where trees can be combined with within agricultural activities. So then those species can also be planted in good land. And I think that some tree species are more demanding in terms of nutrient from a good land than others. So that's why it's so important for those establishing agroforestry systems to look into the matching species and soil conditions and site conditions.
Yes, and I think we'll refer to that in the second webinar too, and really different species for different sites and different species for different timber markets as well. I suppose there's a question here from Richard. What about, do we have any experience or advice regards to planting agroforestry on an area of wetter land, which would usually have a high level of rush cover? Jim, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I just think it comes back to your earlier point, really. You choose your tree for your site. And if you have wetter, heavier land, then you plant whatever tree is going to go best on that, which might be birch or alder or something like that, or willow even. And someone else, I think, has asked about carbon sequestration. Well, really, whatever tree grows the most vigorously was going to give you the most sequestration, because I think really the carbon value of wood is pretty much the same over most types of tree. So it's just simply get as much growth as you can is the answer. And of course, trees will help to dry out the ground. And where you have heavy ground, it can be a good way of starting to get that land into to better productivity if you've got trees in it, and been able to extend the length of the grazing season can also help the grassland utilisation on that as well.
Yeah, Jim, and we'll be talking in the second webinar about a site we've planted at Greenmount, and I must say, where you walk in from the grazing paddock into an area which had been planted for 20 years, it is incredible the difference in moisture. The trees really can dry the ground up. Here's another question. Rodrigo, I suppose this one for you. Can you continue to grow agroforestry in the same plot? So long term, after you think you get to harvesting stage, what are the issues then after harvest? Do you, in a way, do you clear fell, or how do you go about it when the timber crop has got to that point?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. We've been thinking about those possibilities of either clear fell an agroforestry plantation at the time when the crop is ready to be harvested, or be even more flexible and see the agroforestry system as a system like continuous forest cover, taking some of the trees at some time and always trying to keep a forest cover in that piece of land. I think there will be factors such as environmental factors and economic factors where the farmer will have to think about, because some of those environmental factors at some point might be more beneficial in the long term for a particular type of farm. Say, for example, in terms of carbon sequestration. Maybe there might be farmers keen to offset some of their emissions from other activities. So then that will be a matter for the farmer to keep this agroforestry system up, storing carbon for a longer time instead of harvesting. But and also there is this economic factor, which is if you have an agroforestry system with a very profitable, marketable type of timber, then maybe there an interest for the farmer to make use of this resource for that particular situation. But I think it will be something that farmers will have to find a balance in terms of these environmental benefits and those economic benefits. This is something that we will be investigating in the future, using these long-term experimental plots to see what are the implications of either harvesting or doing a different type of management for this agroforestry system.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. There's a couple of questions here, very relevant to each other. Have there been any research, Jim? I think this is for you, really. Any research carried out into silvopastoral systems in hills and uplands? And a second question, are you aware of any wetter areas and upland farms that have been planted and improved? I suppose thinking about the other farm you'd have worked on in the past in the project, and maybe some you've seen down south or across in England. Do you want to comment on those?
Yeah. one of the things I would say that there is across the British Isles, there have been a network of trials on agroforestry. For example, our site at Loughgall was part of a national network experiment where we all did exactly the same things. So we were able to get good statistical evidence. And some of those sites were in the hills and uplands. For example, near Aberdeen, there was a site at high altitude where they planted larch and Scotch pine and things like that, and sycamore. So we found that there's a lot of evidence now, scientific evidence, supporting evidence for growing trees in different scenarios. And in Northern Ireland, we had a sister site really up at Brishain in the Antrim Hills, where we were looking at where we tried ash as well, but sycamore did exceptionally well. And on Gibson Sheep Farm up there, now there you can still see quite a mature sycamore agroforest where you have sheep doing perfectly well on a very drier soil, and the grass performance improving really. You talk also about damper, wetter sites. I think we've already mentioned it's pick your tree for your site and get the best growth for your tree. And also think about the sward as well. A lot of new interesting research coming about using mixed species swards. Different grasses that respond well, clovers do well, some legumes do well under shade. And I think there's a lot of experimenting we could do and playing around with what we grow below the trees to add additional value to the system in terms of animal nutrition and in terms of the quality of the output. They in turn also tend to store carbon better as well. I think there really are exciting opportunities to come up with a really high carbon producing system which is still producing food and other beneficial outputs.
Thank you, Jim. We'll switch back a couple of questions really about silvo-arable. So Rodrigo, here's an interesting one. Is it possible to do no minimum till, no-till silvo-arable agroforestry? So I suppose whenever we were planting the crop of spring barley at Loughgall, was it always a ploughed system, or was it do we ever use minimum tillage in that system?
Well, we in the case of poplar and barley, as you showed on the video clip, that was a site which was plowed. So then we haven't actually, we don't have experiences of a minimum tillage for a silvo-arable system. But there are in other countries experiences of minimum tillage and using silvo-arable system. I think it's something that we could look at, and also at the moment we have that experimental trial back now to grass, in which I think is an alternative to do this type of grassland system of using minimum plowing.
Okay. Planting date, Rodrigo. A few questions here on best planting date for trees.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because a lot of people ask about which are the dates or suitable dates for planting in this country. We are lucky in this country that we have rainfall and good conditions to grow trees. Normally, the best time for planting is either early winter in November, or before springtime between February, March. I think it's not advisable to plant in the middle of winter because, well, we all know that it's too hard. The ground is too hard, and some tree species are very sensitive to those conditions. But in general, I think we can go from late February to April, May, and then November, October. But also is worth mentioning that depending on the type of tree species and how those tree species are coming from tree nurseries, whether are bare root trees or containerized trees. And I think if you are using trees in containers, the window is wider. Keeping plants in container will keep those trees for longer. So I'll give you a little bit of extra time for planting out.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. And thank you, everybody, for all the questions. There's a lot of them. I'm just working through them here. A question from Noel here about tree protection and damage by sheep or appropriate breeds. I'm going to keep that one, Noel, to our meeting next Tuesday night, because we're going to look at quite a few different tree guards that we have worked on and chat about different people's experience. So we'll come back to that next Tuesday night. Let me see. How long is it from planting to grazing? Well, that one we're really grazing pretty immediately. Once we have the trees planted and protected, we start the grazing season. So that we'll chat about that again next Tuesday night. Okay, yeah, and this is a good one here, Rodrigo. Would you recommend trying to drain the land before planting trees, though it is low-lying to start with?
Well, we all know in the country there are a lot of drainage in different farm sites, and I think depending again on the species and the type of soil, and we know that a heavy soil is no good for sycamore trees, for example. But normally, if you have a very good agricultural land, you wouldn't need to do a lot of work on that area, depending on the tree species, and that would be the more advisable things to say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll chat about that again next Tuesday. I guess there was one other thought that while I have you here, Rodrigo, a couple of questions about ash dieback, naturally enough. One here, it was thought that open understory in agroforestry could prevent the spread of ash dieback. What is the current thinking? Any comments?
Yes, there was a research coming out a few months ago looking at the incidence of ash dieback depending on density or planting stocks in different situations, forest situation, isolated trees, and I think the suggestion was that the more distance are the trees, the incidence of the disease is less prevalent. So then there is something there. I'm not aware of any study here in Northern Ireland nor in the South about this planting density, how isolated trees are better or are coping better with the disease rather than having a conventional forestry, conventional planting, a lot of trees together, how that would affect the disease. I know that colleagues in the South and colleagues in other parts of the UK are looking at trying to identify ash trees that have some resistance to the disease, and if the number of trees which are found are big enough, those trees in the future could be propagated so that would become the main population of trees for planting. But at this stage, it's very early. I think some of the farmers or some of the audience probably have already seen the damage around the country, especially around hedgerows and different counties is very badly affected.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. I'm going to, it's been great, all these questions, but I'm going to take our time to wrap it up now because we've gone over the hour event. And thank you very much all for your attendance. And I will remind you that there is a second agroforestry webinar on next Tuesday night. And that it will cover experiences of planting, tree guards. We'll chat about local provenance. You know, so quite a lot of the practical experience in the early years, which are the trickiest ones. So I would refer you to a couple of publications I've come across recently: a Soil Association Agroforestry Handbook. If you just type that into Google, Agroforestry Handbook, that will come up. Another one, a Chuggas publication, A Forest to Suit Every Farm, which has got good case studies in it, and a couple of agroforestry ones there. I would remind you that on Thursday night of this week at 7 o'clock, there is another webinar on the EFS scheme in general, the Tranche 4, the scheme outline, options and compliance. I'd just like to thank Jim and Rodrigo very much. They've been excellent presentations. There is a wealth of research there, and I always enjoy listening to them. And finally, we have a 1-minute survey. There's 2 questions for you to help us improve these events going forward. Once the event is completed, please do not shut your screen down. Instead, wait for the host to finish the call, and this will allow you to receive the short survey and provide your valued feedback. So thank you once again for attending, panelists and participants.